Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to another short video on a progress update of my InMoov build. This video I'm going to be covering the left forearm, but before I do that I just wanted to have a quick recap on everything I've done so far on the build. So I wanted to briefly just look back at the overall build and try and tell you the approach that I'm taking to the build as a whole. There's various different aspects in this build, loads of different parts that you can work on, and you can decide which parts you work on first. I think when Guile first started out on this project, he started with the hand, went on to the forearm, and then up to the torso and the biceps and the shoulders. And then only after that did he move up and start working on the head, and then leaving the legs until last. But you can, now that Guile's done all that work and all the parts are available to us, you can decide how you want to approach the build, how you want to start, which areas you want to work on first, which ones you want to leave till later. I started with the eyes, moved on to the head and the neck and the torso, started work on the shoulder, got a bit bored with that, went on to the hand, and as you can see I'm about to embark on the forearm. What I'm doing with this, I'm hitting a lot of problems, and the approach I'm trying to take is that whenever I hit a problem, instead of dwelling on it and wasting loads of time trying to solve that particular problem and holding up the build as a whole, what I'm doing is every time I hit a problem, I'm just putting it to one side and moving on to a different area of the build. That way I don't get bored on one particular part, I don't hold up the whole project, so everything keeps moving. So you can see I've got the head, the neck, the torso, all these shoulder parts that I'm working on, the hand we saw in the previous video. I've even started some of the wrist parts. I just occasionally print odd bits when I'm bored. And now I'm even moving on to the forearm. Now you might think, well, nothing's finished. Nothing's working properly. There's problems everywhere. And you'd be right. There is problems everywhere. Every single part I've worked on has got some kind of issue with it. You can see the skull, it's not completely painted. I've got issues around some of the joints. I've got issues with the jaw. I've got issues with the neck rotation. But I want to show you all those problems. There's two reasons I want to show you those problems and talk about the problems. Is one, I'm hoping that you'll comment on them. I'm hoping you'll leave comments in these videos and tell me how I can solve some of these issues. And secondly, I want you to see that this isn't plain sailing. There are lots of problems. If you're going to build one of these yourselves, you are going to hit these problems as well, and you can look at it then and know that there are other people with the same issues, and there's a great support community for this project. There's Guile's website, inmove.fr, there's a Google group, you've got Twitter, and of course you've got YouTube. So you can get help to solve these problems. I've already had people commenting, telling me how to fix some of the issues, which is giving me things to think about and areas I can go back and work on. But the main point is, when you get a problem, don't worry about it. The help is there. There's other parts of the build you can move on to. You don't have to stop just because you're stuck on one particular problem. Some of the problems I'm having, the eyes, they just don't seem to have as much movement as I was expecting. Someone's commented that maybe the servos aren't centered. The up and down movement, they kind of tilt on a mechanism in there. The print quality of the parts was poor on the original printer, and they were too tight. Had to do lots of filing. The parts didn't come out with a very good shape. I think I can solve that now. I've got a newer printer. The parts are coming out much better quality, so I think reprinting some of the parts. When I drilled out some of the components for the eyes, I snapped off some of the supports for the cameras, So when I do come to print the cameras, I'm going to need to reprint those parts and replace those broken parts. Again, shouldn't be a problem with the new printer. I'm probably going to completely dismantle the skull. I think I assembled the skull in the wrong order. It was really difficult to get the bits to fit together. I've seen some views where people have got the skull in separate sections, and they've got the back section here, the sides and the face. They've got all of those, they all nut and bolt together. So I think they could all be assembled as one single unit. I could then fill and sand and then paint as a whole that whole bottom part of the skull. Possibly a similar thing with the top of the skull. As possible to make the skull in one piece, or not make it in one piece, but merge some of these parts together, fill in the gaps, and paint it as a whole piece, so that the entire top of the skull lifts off as a single piece. Again, eliminating a lot of these lines and gaps. Just make the whole thing look generally a lot better. The jaw is not really working. It has got the piston inside, but that's all a bit tight. I haven't actually tried it. I'm pretty sure that's not going to work, so I'll be reprinting the piston at some point. The neck rotation works, but it's a bit stiff. Suddenly it will stick, and then suddenly it will fly the head around. I think when I was putting the gears together, they seem to be too tight. I think reprinting the gears on the new printer will probably solve that issue. This neck piston, I deliberately shrunk the piston down so it wasn't so tight, knowing that I'd had previous problems with the jaw gear being tight. But I think I've overdone it, shrunk it too much, and there's too much play in this. There's quite a lot of movement in there without any rotation. So I think I need to reprint this neck piston and not shrink it down. Hopefully it'll tighten it up a little bit and make the movement a bit smoother. I've actually printed quite a few of the shoulder parts. I haven't done a video yet on the shoulder. I will be covering that soon. I briefly stopped working on the shoulder because I was having a real problem printing the worm gear. I just couldn't get the support material off. I printed it with support material, and then I just couldn't remove the support material. But this one was printed on my new printer, and it's come out absolutely superb. The support material just broke away, no problems. So much better quality. So now I've solved that issue, I probably will come back and work on the shoulder. But one problem I'm having is this part here was printed on the original printer, and the worm gear was printed on the new printer, and they don't really fit together. That worm gear won't sit in there. So I think I'll redo this part on the new printer, and hopefully that'll solve the issue. The worm gear should slot in. I'm slightly worried that that might lead on to other issues, like the next piece that has to go on may not fit, and I may end up reprinting almost all the parts. But I don't think I'll have to do that. I think I'll get away with some of them, but I definitely will need to redo this one. I've printed some of the other shoulder parts. Shoulder piston here has come out superb on the new printer. I forget which is which now. There's the piston threads here. There's a larger one and a smaller one, and I forget which one goes where. I think one goes in the bicep and one goes in the shoulder. This piston fits into one of those two, and it was very tight. I filed it down. So I will come back to the shoulder at some point, so there'll be a future video on the shoulder. Then onto the hand. That was the last video. I've printed the palm of the hand, the thumb and the forefingers. I've started running the threading through them to make them move. Taking a break from that at the moment. I will need to come back and revisit this. Some of the joints are too tight, they'll need to be loosened up. Not 100% happy with the quality of some of the parts. We shouldn't really be able to see this rectangular piece here. That should be completely filled in. So I'll probably come back and revisit that, try and tidy those up a bit. Some of them are lacking in the white paint. They need a bit more, couple more coats of white paint. You can still see a lot of the grey coming through. I need to reprint. I need to print the covers that go on the back of the hand. That will cover up these nasty nuts. Make the hand just generally look a little bit better, and I also need to glue on the fingertips and the tip of the thumb. So the next part of the build is the left forearm. This comprises of 4 cover pieces. You can see I've printed 3 out here. I've got 1 more yet to do. There's 2 top pieces, 2 bottom pieces, so they fit together to form the whole forearm. So there'll be another one to go with this one, and then there's these 2 which will go on the end, which would give us the complete forearm. And then on the end of that, if you can use your imagination a little bit, this cap goes on the end. I believe it goes that way round with this little cutout here lining up with the hinge part here. So with the 4 parts to the shell and the cap on the end, that essentially builds up the entire shell of the forearm. And then on this end, on here, we'll fit the wrist. The wrist is motorized, so gives us wrist rotation. So I'll probably cover the wrist separately in a separate video. This video I'll just stick to the forearm. We probably won't get on to fitting the servos, as I don't have any yet. And I probably will fit the servo bed. These, once I get the next part off, we'll have 5 parts here, and these 5 parts total up to about 30 hours of printing time, so there's quite a bit of work gone into this already. So these are all at various stages. This one has just been printed and gently filed, just mainly around the perimeter. Don't really need to do much work on that. We're not really going to see most of this part, and the end that is shown is pretty flat and smooth anyway, so not much to do with that. This one has just come off the printer. It hasn't been filed at all, still quite rough on here. The camera's not showing it up, but there's quite a few ridges in there that are going to need to be smoothed out. So what I do is I gently file them. It takes quite a lot of time. I just sort of work on one particular area, keep working away at it until I start to get it smooth, then move on to another area, then gradually work my way around the whole part. Once I've got it, most of the ridges sort of smoothed down, I then give it a sanding with a medium grit sandpaper. At that point it's feeling pretty smooth. I do go over it again with some wet and dry paper, which is even more fine grained. And that gives us a really smooth finish, but as you run your finger across it, you can still feel the low points, and if you hold it in the light, you can still see those low points. Even after all that filing and sanding, you just cannot get rid of the low points. You got rid of all the high points because you sanded them all off, but you still got those low points that you just cannot get to. So what I use then is I put some filler into the. So after I've got it to that stage, you can see the next one here. I've completely covered the whole part with filler. This is probably not the best stuff to be using, but it's the only thing I've got to hand. It's an Artex filler. It's really for decorating. It's very easy to sand, very soft. Probably too soft, but it's like I said, that's all I have to hand. That's what I've been using. I completely cover the whole part with this. I try to push it right in to get it into those low points. Cover the entire area, the whole part, even if they don't look like they need it. And then just leave that to set. Leave it all night. I leave it overnight. Give it plenty of time to set hard. Then I come back the next day and sand it down just with the fine grade wet and dry paper. Don't use the files, don't use the medium grit sandpaper, just the really fine wet and dry paper. You sand most of the filler off, but you can just about make out in this camera. You can see that there is filler now in the low points, and the whole thing now feels completely smooth. I can no longer feel any ridges in it. I can see them because the filler is white and the part is white, but they're different shades of white, so I can still see the lines in there, but I can't feel them. That's the important thing, because when we put the paint on this, it should then give us an even colour all over and everything will be smooth, and hopefully even tipping it in the light we won't be able to see those lines. That's the goal anyway. That's what I'm hoping and aiming for. It's very tempting to start painting when you've just sanded the original part down and you've still got those low points. It's very tempting to think that the filler primer will fill those low points, but it won't. I've done it loads of times now, and it looks great when you first paint it, and then after the paint starts to dry it really sinks into those low points, and you hold it in the light and it's terrible. You can see all the lines. So I think it's worth the extra effort. It's only maybe another hour's work just to fill it and sand it. It's just the waiting overnight for it to set hard. But the bit of patience, these look like they're going to come out much better. So this one's finished. It's ready to painting. Again, it's tempting to paint it now, but I'm going to resist that temptation and assemble the whole thing together. And I can start to look at the joints, and maybe some of these parts will need filing a bit more. I want to try and get everything super prepared before I start painting it. So for now this one's done. This one here has got the filler set hard, so the next job is to sand that over. This one here needs to be filed and filled and sanded, so there's quite a bit of work to do on this one, and then the last one's not even printed yet. So there's a lot of work still to do just to get this shell put together. That's before we go on to the internals with a servo bed and cable guides and things like that. So I've now got all 5 pieces for the forearm. So I've glued the first side piece to the base, just around the back there. It's just glued together, glue in there. And then the next stage is to glue this next section on, and then the other 2 pieces will glue together. So glue these 2 pieces together to make one piece, but then these are removable, so we don't glue these on. They fit in there, and there's some nut and bolts. There's some nuts to fit in here, there I believe, and there. So there's 4 nuts, and then this piece screws on, so it's removable. We can get to the servos inside. So I'll glue this piece on. Okay, so I applied some glue around the joint. So on Giles' tutorial he suggests that you use clamps here and here. I don't have any clamps, so I've just used a piece of tape. Just tape them together at these 2 points. So we want to make sure this edge is flush after we've glued it, so the other piece fits onto it nicely. So I could go ahead now and glue these two halves together, glue this joint here. So I think I'll do that. So I've glued that one as well. And again I've put some tape around the sides just to try and keep these sides level whilst the glue dries. Put a bit of extra glue on the inside just to give it a little bit more strength. I'm just using super glue here, I'm not using any other sort of glue. So I'll let that dry now, probably leave that overnight, let that dry. Once it's dried I'll take the tape off and I'll put some filler in here, and we'll try and sand this down and completely eliminate the line here. And then the same on this one, put some filler around this joint, sand that down smooth. And the same with the joint at the bottom, you can't really see it so it doesn't matter that much, but I will put some filler around that and sand that as well. We should then be ready to paint these parts. So I'm just trying to get the nuts to fit into this wrist part. This isn't the bolt I'll use because that's too long, I was just using a long one to make it easier to hold. The nuts are just a little bit too tight to fit into their recesses, so the idea is to heat them up, heat the plastic up, and then try to squash them into the hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten the nut and bolt up so it's just starting to nip into the plastic. Then I'm going to try heating it with a heat gun and then tightening up the screw to see if that will pull the nut into the recess. Okay, that was easy, that actually didn't need any heat. I just tightened the screw up and the nut has pulled into the recess. So I'll give the other side a go. So there we go, the two nuts are in place. I did just apply a little bit of heat to the second side. So this part has been filed down and sanded, and I've given it a coating of filler. It's pretty tricky to see in this camera. I'm just going to let that harden a little bit more, and then I'll sand it down very gently with some fine sandpaper. Okay, so this part's all glued now. I've taken the tape off. I've applied some filler around this joint. I haven't sanded it yet, I'm going to let that dry hard. Whilst I'm waiting for that, I'm going to try and fit the two nuts in here and here. In fact, there's 4 nuts because there's 2 more, one down here and one in here. I'm going to try and use the same technique as I did on the part for the wrist, and I'm just going to put a bolt through here and loosely tighten the nut up, apply a little bit of heat with the heat gun and then tighten it. I will need to just run a 3mm drill through these holes first. So I've glued the first part of the wrist onto the top of the forearm and filled across the joint and sanded it down smooth. So that's now the whole arm together. And then there's the cover that goes on top. We also briefly looked at this part of the wrist when I was fitting the nuts inside. That just pushes onto the top. Obviously at some point we'll put the servo inside there. So let's just take a quick look at the parts that go inside the forearm. So we have the servo bed, the rear cable guide and the front cable guide. I believe the reason they're called front and rear is when they sit inside the arm, this cable guide guides the cables into the front servos, and then this one's guiding it into the rear servos. I originally thought this rear cable guide actually went on the rear, but it doesn't. It goes in the middle. This attaches on here with a screw, but this can go either way around, and looking in the holes, which you can't really see, they're angled, so I think I've got it on the right way around, but it does go the other way around as well, so I need to double check that, although I don't think the tutorial actually explains that. The front cable guide is a lot simpler because it's got two lugs that just push into these square holes here. I did just have to file out the square holes a little bit and file the lugs, then it just pushed together. I haven't glued it, it feels pretty solid, I don't think it needs any glue. So then lastly we have the tensioner bracket. That has a hole here, so I believe that lines up with the hole where the screw is going to go, so I believe we just put that on there and then put the screw through, and it holds all three parts together. So they will just sit inside here. There's two screws, I believe, to screw them in, one here and one here. This part will obviously already be attached, so that will be in there as well. So sometime in the future I'll have to fit the servos in here and run the cables through from the hand and finish up the wrist. That's about it for now. This cover just fits on here, and it just pushes in here, and then a screw here and a screw on the other side. I think there's two screws here as well, so there's four screws that hold that on, and that is basically the whole forearm. So there it is. That's the first forearm, the left forearm I believe it is. I'll leave it there for now. Hopefully I'll be back with another video soon where I'll probably be working on the wrist and hopefully get the hand attached to this forearm. Not quite sure when I'm going to get the servos, so we might not get the servos in on the next video, but we should hopefully get the wrist all attached. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Please leave comments below. If you liked the video, share it. I'll see you next time.